Hello and welcome to another episode of the Album Years in our new environs. Now this is the new Crystal Spotlight podcast studio. It's very swanky, isn't it?
It's glorious.
It's very swanky, and we got all this amazing, like, super top tier hi-fi equipment behind us. So maybe on future episodes we can actually spin some of these, some of these records, and then we could do a sort of, like a jukebox jury, trash the record if we don't like it.
And I think it's a perk that we get
smash it
at the end of it as well.
We
get given the record player.
We get given the record.
Yeah.
But we can smash the records over our knee if we don't like them. What do you think? You like that idea?
I love that idea because I think I used to do that as a teenager. I used to find ways of destroying albums.
You've told me all about it. You've told me about lining telephone boxes with egg albums and things.
Tying them on pieces of string off the cantilever bridge.
Brilliant. I love that. So we are in the new studio and we're doing 1972 today, folks. 1972. Now, just a disclaimer to start with. 1972, Tim, shock horror, is the only year between 1969 and 1987 that the Ham did nothing.
He did a few gigs, I think.
No, I'm talking about...
No, he
didn't release an album. Didn't release an album.
He did not. And I think they did attempt to do a follow-up to Porn Hearts in 1972, but it didn't pan out.
Didn't release it. So we've got nothing so we're going to have to name check him anyway at the top of the show. We're not going to be talking about the Ham. There is an irony there. Anyway, the other big thing about this year is for the first time, we are going to be having some listeners' reviews. We've opened up a website that's enabling you guys out there to leave your own reviews of some of the albums from 1972. So we haven't listened to them yet ourselves. So Rob from Crystal Spotlight has chosen some that he thinks are interesting, and we're going to go over to hear your reviews when we get to the albums in question, and we'll be able to comment on your reviews as well, whether we agree with you, whether we disagree with you. Let's just dive in. This was a great year. Well, it's certainly in the UK, and I understand this is a very UK-centric thing. Glam rock was kind of defining the year, wasn't it? At least in terms of the charts. The mainstream glam rock was the big thing. And it had kind of been bubbling under for a while. T.Rex had hits the year before. But this is the year that it all comes together, really coalescing around, I think, a handful of albums.
Yeah.
So let's talk about those albums. And the first album we want to talk about really is the debut album of Roxy Music. Now, I understand we have a listeners, straight in, we're going to go to listeners. We've got a listeners review of the Roxy Music debut album. So let's hear that review, please, Rob.
Oh my God, 1972, the first Roxy Music album. What a bunch of talent. Brian Eno, Phil Manzanera, Brian Ferry. What a beautiful songs like 2HB or Remake to Remodel with the first video clip that is a incredible video that Brian Ferry still love it. It's one of the best rock albums and one of the best glam rock albums for me.
We're not going to disagree with that, are we, Tim?
Not at all, though the only thing I'd partly disagree with is the glam rock. That I kind of think they were glam rock by association because of their image. I kind of think that Roxy combined so many ideas. They came from an art school background, and if you listen to that album, it has elements of rock and roll, glam, R&B, but it also has elements of the kind of psychedelic underground of the late 60s, the progressive music of the early 70s. It seems to eat everything up and be totally on top of every influence they're using. And I kind of think that their image may be accidentally, because I feel this sometimes with the Lou Reed, that Lou Reed was a very serious individual, and I think he always saw himself as a short story writer, and yet he became this kind of glam sleaze as far as the press were concerned. And Roxy, I think, got caught up in the glam mania. But
isn't that the point about all kind of labels and genres, though? I mean, I'm looking at this list of albums that are nominally in the glam section here, Wham Glam as we've called it.
Yeah.
You could say the same about all of them, really. I mean, Slade were never a glam band, were they? But they kind of hitched a ride on the bandwagon. Lou Reed, as you say, Bowie even. I mean, he kind of hitched a ride. Or in some respects, you could say Bowie defined it.
Yeah.
But there was no such thing as glam rock, really, until Mark Bolan went on Top of the Pops wearing the glitter under his eyes. And then suddenly the press decide this is This is a genre. This is a movement. And haven't we seen that happen so many times over the year, from
We
psychedelic music to punk rock to Britpop to grunge? It's a question of the press or the media creating a bubble,
Yeah.
and then other bands kind of using that as a platform or as a springboard to get a record deal, to get a record out, to get some press. So you're right. I think Roxy, but you're right. I think the image is the thing that kind of people remember.
Yeah.
Very flamboyant image, which puts them right in the vanguard of being a glam act, doesn't it?
Well, I think what it was with Roxy and possibly even with Bowie as well, that they were responding. You know, a lot of movements are reactions to what is the prevailing trend. And I suppose that rock had become more serious, more academic, whether it was the singer-songwriters or the progressive rock bands. Bowie, T.Rex, Roxy were all about putting entertainment at the forefront as much as art.
But this is the interesting thing, isn't it? I mean, Roxy, although you point out musically they were drawing from all these different traditions, there's something about the way they market themselves that is about glamour, the artwork, the imagery, some of the lyrical subject matter. Brian Ferry was always fascinated with glamour and the high life, wasn't he? He was always fascinated by the way the rich people seemed to me. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, he was a working class lad from Newcastle, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And he seemed to have aspirations to be living on a yacht, in Ibiza.
Lewis-style aspirations.
Lewis style, yeah. And a lot of the artwork, I mean, even going through some of his solo records from late in the 70s, always on the front cover in this sort of tuxedo, standing next to a pool in Ibiza.
It's sort of transcending the griminess of his upbringing, I think. But this is it, I suppose, with Ferry and with Roxy Music, I think it was very natural. I think the album, the image, was a very unself-conscious extension of their passions and their interests. Whereas I think with Bowie, Slade, and some of the artists that came afterwards, if you like, Cockney Rebel, Bebop Deluxe, I think they cleverly and brilliantly self-consciously hitched themselves onto something, whereas I think that Roxy arrived at this place sweet, exactly.
Bricklayers from Hull.
Indeed, and so I think, Ziggy Stardust was that to a certain extent. I think Bowie was always canny and aware of what was happening, and of course he was friends with Mark Bolan.
But I think the difference is Bowie and Bolan could pull off the androgyny thing, whereas Slade and Sweet couldn't. And I think Slade were very aware of that, and they almost played up against the pantomime.
Well, Slade had been a skinhead band,
exactly,
at one point,
So I think they kind of played up the pantomime aspect of it. We know we look like bricklayers, but let's just, the whole Dave Hill thing with the ridiculous trying to outdo himself with the more ridiculous outfits every time they're on top of the pops. Whereas I think Bowie and Bolan really pulled off the androgynous
They did, and arguably, T.Rex or Bolan invented it, really, because he was kind of leading towards this. And they were very natural, again. But his influences, he came out of something that was more like the kind of incredible string band, the early Tyrannosaurus Rex, the ramshackle experimental psychedelic folk of the early Tyrannosaurus Rex albums. But you can hear it on the later Tyrannosaurus Rex albums, and certainly the first T.Rex album, where it really naturally fuses from this into him bringing in kind of Eddie Cochran rock and roll influences.
Now, is that also something that's interesting? You kind of alluded to this in the Roxy, that I think there was a reaction against the sort of bombast and pretension of progressive rock. And there is a sense of getting back to rock and roll, and you hear it in Roxy, you hear it in Bowie's Ziggy Stardust album, you hear it in T.Rex, you certainly hear it in Slade. There is a sort of wanting to go back, and Lou Reed wanting to go back to the heyday of rock and roll and pop, pure pop. Bolan always said he was setting out to be a singles band when he felt like everyone else had forgotten to make great pop singles, in the early 70s. Everyone was making these big conceptual rock albums. He wanted to get back to, let's just make great pop singles the kids can get behind. And there is an element of that all the way through these glam albums, isn't there, from this year?
There is, though I'd say that Bowie and Roxy manage to pull off both. That I think they appeal
T-Rex as well. I think the Slider.
But I'm saying that in terms of appealing to the serious progressive underground album audience, that Roxy and Bowie totally pull that off, as well as managing to produce the hit singles at the right time and have the image at the right time.
The rock snobs were a little bit suspicious of Mark Bolan, weren't they?
They were, exactly.
Even though I think the Slider, artistically speaking, creatively speaking, is right up there.
Yeah.
Right up there with the Roxy album and the Ziggy album, you know. And but I think the problem was Mark had kind of burned a lot of his bridges because he'd gone from being, you know, a pop star wannabe to a hippie when it was fashionable to be a hippie, and then suddenly he was something else because it was no longer fashionable. Well, I think he was a fashion victim, but then Bowie was too. Let's be honest.
But I suppose the thing is, as you say, Bolan pulled off the image, and he was a bona fide teen idol.
Yeah,
and he was also being dropped by people like John Peel around this time.
He was, yeah.
Whereas Bowie and Roxy were still being courted by the likes of Sounds, NME, John Peel, and so on. So I think there was a different perception that T.Rex somehow had transcended their underground roots and become a total teen pop sensation. And you're right, it's unfair, because I think The Slider is arguably one of the most consistent albums that came out at just the right time.
Yeah.
And it's a great cover. You know, I know it's a blurred photograph by Ringo Starr, but it's a great cover. Really
very
simple,
iconic.
but very, very, as you say, iconic.
Well, a lot of these albums have these very iconic covers. I mean, who can think of David Bowie, Ziggy Stardust without immediately thinking of that cover, you know, on that location. So we love the Roxy Music album, so completely concur with the listener there. But I think it is a completely impossible to. I mean, I've had the pleasure of remixing the album. It's fascinating to go into it and just see what's going on in there. It's this extraordinary. Virginia Plain's not even on the record, but one of the great pop singles of all time, I think. Extraordinary, just so unique.
Well, I think, you know, we could go into every single track, but I remember that Brian Eno said that what he loved about the album was that there was something like 8 tracks and there were 8 potential future directions for the music of Roxy music.
Chance Meeting.
Yeah. Chance Meeting, classic, a wonderful piece. But I'd say that actually there's about 16 different directions, maybe more, 24, because you listen to some of these tracks, and what I love about this album is the sheer unpredictability. So you have something like If There Is Something that starts off almost as a jaunty country piece and ends up as an apocalyptic art rock piece with very screaming hysterically. You know, what's really interesting is that these pieces embrace so much and they play like their lives depend on it. And you listen to some of these tracks as well, there's a lot of kind of progressive and underground influences. There's a lot of free jazz in there. There's a lot of King Curtis soul in there.
There's a lot of Dadaism as well, which you know, something you associate with Eno later on, like the backing vocals on the first track is just a number plate. Is that right? A number plate they were reading off a car. So they didn't have any lyrics, so they just recited them. So there's that Dadaist aspect to it. But I mean, also tracks like Sea Breeze is very brooding, almost sinister undercurrent.
Incredibly intense. And as well, they deal with dissonance as much as King Crimson dealt with dissonance and soft. And you can hear that Manzanera had come out of kind of Soft Machine, early Pink Floyd, as those sort of influences. They're in there somewhere. I think this is it. It's such an intriguing, free-flowing album.
It was an outlier at the time, and it's still an outlier, isn't it? It's still very hard to talk about that album as we put it in the glam. Obviously, we talked about this a few minutes ago, that everything in this glam category, in a sense, is kind of an imposter, because the whole glam genre didn't really exist, except it did, but only in the very kind of mainstream pop area.
Yeah.
The albums that we take seriously that have stood the test of time are only very obliquely related to anything like a label anyway. And the Roxy is a great example. Is the same true of Ziggy? I mean, it's kind of nominally seen as the definitive glam rock album, but it's not really, is it? I mean, it's...
No, I think it's, it's one of my least favourite Bowie albums, and that's not to say I dislike it, because I think it's a great album.
Agreed.
It sounds fantastic. I mean, one of the things is that Roxy music, I adore. My favourite in this category. But it's very murky. The production's murky. It's by Pete Sinfield of King Crimson.
You need to listen to my remix, mate. It's miles better.
I thought that sounded even murkier.
Did you actually listen to it?
Yeah, I've got it.
Have you listened to it 5.1?
I bought it. You didn't give it to me. I bought it.
They didn't give me a copy. I had to buy it myself. Anyway, carry on.
So yeah, I did. I bought it. It sounds fun. Yeah, you've done a great job.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thanks.
You made all the changes. Well done. I think Ziggy sounds very clear, very competent. It's a great production for the age. And I kind of see it as his Purple Rain, in that it's a fantastic album that comes out at the right time. And it's got these often pared down arrangements. You listen to the first few pieces, it's very unpredictable, beginning with little drum patterns. And it's very uncluttered. The production on that album, I think.
I think maybe this is slightly contradicting you in this way, but what I was going to say, what springs to mind for me, is when I listen to it again, I'm surprised how conventional it is.
Yeah, no, that's totally.
Okay, in relation to not just the Roxy album and even the Slider, but also the rest of the Bowie cat. In fact, what came before and after it, Hunky
Yeah.
Dory and Aladdin Sane. It's actually more conventional, isn't it? It's a more conventional heavy rock stroke folk rock. I mean, you can still hear the influence of from his singer songwriter.
Yeah.
The songs are great, but I think apart from the first track, which for me is the outlier, 5 years, it's actually a surprisingly conventional rock and roll album.
It is, and apart from near the end, they're surprisingly slow to medium tempo, because I always think of this as being quite an aggressive album.
Well,
but a
Suffragette
lot
City,
of it,
yeah.
But a lot of it is actually quite medium tempo. It's quite a safe Bowie album. I mean, I love Space Oddity, Man Who Saw the World, fantastically off-kilter record, and Hunky Dory was almost Bowie's attempt to do a kind of a Plastic Ono band, a stripped down singer-songwriter record in the Bowie style. And again, it's one of my favourite Bowie albums. So this doesn't compete with me in terms of being a personal favourite, but it's almost like, apart from the imagery and the cover, this is Bowie reining himself in and making the right album at the right time, because you listen to Aladdin Sane and Diamond Dogs, and he's unleashed.
Because he's
firing off.
By then, he's kind of got the mandate to do what he wants, hasn't he? So, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Hunky Dory wasn't a big success. Ziggy was the big breakthrough.
Ziggy, I think, was the big breakthrough.
So at that point, he's like, I've made the record. I've made my accessible record. I've got everyone looking in my direction now. Now I can go off and start to introduce these other more interesting elements.
It was the album that got him on Top of the Pops. It's the album that gave him license to be himself.
Yes.
I think. So I really like it. It's really well done. And again, although it's safe, listen to Moon Age Daydream, and there are lovely little arrangement touches.
Think it's safe, relatively safe in the context of his career, and safe perhaps when you compare it to an album like the Roxy debut.
Absolutely. And the least safe element of it probably is his voice, which is, Ferry's voice is ultra quirky.
Yes.
Bowie's voice is still very passionate and quirky on this. And it's something that we'll probably come to when we discuss...
Voice,
Bonan's as well.
Much odder than Bowie's, I think, in that sense,
But when we discuss Foxtrot, I think what's interesting with Bowie is that though he's kind of wearing a mask, I think this is really not a concept album in any sense. I think this is a carefully curated Bowie singer-songwriter rock album with some great hooks, great arrangements. For me, I think it begins well and ends well. I think the opening track is superb, last track is brilliant, and there's some classics in between. But as I said, it's never kind of gripped me in the way that Aladdin Sane,
I agree.
Diamond Dogs.
And I think it is relative, because it's an utterly brilliant album.
Yeah.
And I like it very much, but like you, it would be one of the lower tier Bowie 70s albums in terms of what I would personally reach for.
But he gets it right in terms of, this is the album that gets him on Top of the Pops, gets him in the magazines.
Absolutely.
And he's honed his image to perfection as well.
Yeah. So other albums that nominally fall into the glam rock category, we mentioned T.Rex, we mentioned Slade's album, Slade, this year. Mott the Hooples, All the Young Dudes, I guess, obviously very closely related to Bowie.
Yeah. Bowie obviously wrote the title track. Which is brilliant. This is it, because Bowie, obviously, he produces and writes for people like Mott the Hoople and Lou Reed this year. And strangely, there are tracks on those albums that I put as my favourite Bowie-related pieces, Perfect Day, or, All the Young Dudes itself. What an amazing piece. I think it's one of Bowie's utter classics. And it manages once more to tie into this kind of rock and roll revivalism, which was happening. There were kind of vintage rock and roll concerts in London in the early 70s. People like, Little Richard, Jerry Lewis, not exactly coming out of retirement, but almost having a second wind, having massive concerts.
I think Chuck Berry had a number one this year with My
Ding-a-ling.
Yeah. Less said about that, the better.
Although, do you want a Hamill reference on this one?
Go on, let's get the ham in.
Fire!
Is that it? Did you just want to say that?
I just wanted to say that, but no. Nick Potter, Van der Graaf's bass player, was in Chuck Berry's band in the early 70s.
I did not know that. There you go, Pop Kids, some fantastic trivia there.
Van der Graaf, Chuck Berry.
Ham trivia there for you. Let's talk about Lou Reed. So 2 albums this year, the debut and Transformer. I think the debut is commonly seen, and this is not my opinion, but it's commonly seen as a bit of a sort of a false start for him.
Yeah.
Isn't it the first album that's got the members of Yes as the backing group or something
It's
bizarre
got Steve Howe and Rick Wakeman, yes.
Yes.
This ties in with another album that we'll discuss later.
Oh, yes.
I love it. I love Lou Reed's debut. It's one of my favourite Lou Reed albums. I mean,
a lot of tracks he wrote for VU. And,
So it would have probably been the VU album after Loaded, but it's arguably better than Loaded. I mean,
I love Loaded.
I think people didn't rate this because it didn't particularly sell. It was seen. It was a more serious album. It's got great pieces like, Ocean for one. It's really quite exploratory. It's quite a serious singer-songwriter rock album coming out of Velvet Underground. Really uncompromising, very strong. Personally love it.
And Transformer then was his kind of commercial high point, wasn't it?
Well,
Bowie produced.
Yeah.
And is that why, or is it also a question of a perfect storm? He just had some great songs. Bowie was in vogue. Bowie produced it. Everything kind of came together.
I think it is a perfect storm. I think as an album, it's less consistent than Lou Reed, but it's really playful, really diverse. It has elements, I suppose, of the eclecticism even of Alice Cooper at this stage, where he could go into a doo-wop or a...
Well, it's got Walk on the Wild Side on it, hasn't
it? Or a Broadway
It's got the
piece.
big hits on it, hasn't it?
But it's got a couple of brilliant pieces. The production is really, really good. And Perfect Day remains one of my favourite Lou Reed pieces. What an astonishing piece of music. And again, the image, the songs and the timing, and I think the Bowie involvement.
Yes, because otherwise it's very, very tenuous, any connection to glam, isn't it, really? But like I said at the beginning of this category, glam was very much in the UK. This was what was happening in the mainstream this year.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the mainstream more broadly now, because some great records came out this year by mainstream artists. Let's first of all talk with another of our favourites, Elton.
Mm-hmm.
He's just on a roll. I mean, I don't know if I've mentioned this on the show before, but I do believe that Elton John's run of albums from 1970 through to 1976 is one of the most incredible runs of songwriting and record making ever. Probably comparable with the Beatles in the 60s. Something like 10 to 12 albums in the space of about 7 years. Every single album has got big, big songs that we all know. These are no exception. Honky Chateau and Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player. Just these 2 albums alone have got Rocket Man. What a single.
Mm-hmm.
What a single. Okay, you could say it's kind of a little bit of a copy of Space Oddity. It's very much in vogue at the time to do songs about space and space travel. Rocket Man, Daniel, Crocodile Rock. But I think what people forget sometimes, I mean, Elton, obviously his singles are so iconic now, and Diamonds continues to sell billions of copies every week, deservedly so. But deep cuts, as the Americans would say, Mona Lisa's and Mad Hatters, if you know that song, off Honky Chateau. High Flying Bird from Don't Shoot Me. Just brilliant, brilliant songs. I mean, the guy is just on fire. The songwriting partnership is just on fire. And similarly, over in America, we got Stevie Wonder putting out 2 incredible records this year. Also, chock-a-block with iconic tracks. Music in My Mind and Talking Book both came out this year. And in a sense, this is also the beginning of one of the most extraordinary runs of albums in the 70s, isn't it? I mean, Talking Book was followed by... Interviews, thank you. Fulfillingless First Finale.
Yeah.
Songs in the Key of Life, and then one of your favourites, the music,
the controversial
the Plant album, or whatever it's called.
The Plant album, the controversial The Plant album.
But these guys are just on fire, aren't they, in terms of just knocking out. And we forget there was a time when this was happening, because these days we get so used to the idea of our big mainstream artists delivering an album after 5 years, and it's seeming like that was quick. Yeah. Only took Adele 5 years to make a follow-up, or only took Harry Styles 4 years to make a follow-up. There was a time when the equivalent artists, the big mainstream pop stars of the day,
and also I think what was interesting is that the albums were often very different, and we've discussed this prolificity, I believe it's called, with Ian Anderson, Jethro Tull. That he was making a studio album a year from the late 60s to the early 80s, I think 1980. and they wildly differed, even though he was on tour for about half the year.
Well, let's get the Ham in here as well. The Ham.
And obviously Peter Hamill's
2 albums a year,
material was
a punk
shifting.
album, a singer-songwriter album.
And what I found curious about
album.
72 is that you're right, some of these artists were just knocking albums out. And some of them might be my favourite album by the artist, some of them might be, mid-level, but then they'd knock out a work of genius 6 months later.
Yeah.
They were almost, not thinking about these. I mean, the Elton John... one of the things people don't talk about, beyond his deep cuts, is that there's a kind of rootsiness to some of his work. Again, he sort of got in with glam with his image as well.
Yes,
his hit singles. I kind of knew him more from the greatest hits, really, as I was a kid, and still to a certain extent. So Rocket Man remains an all-time Elton John favourite for me. And Daniel is, there's some really heartbreaking, great material. I knew, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, fantastic song and really interesting album. But what's interesting about Elton is that he's drawing from, you can hear the band, he's kind of listening to roots artists.
Bernie Taupin and Elton were big fans of music from the Big Pink. I think that was, Tumbleweed Connection is kind of like
Neil Young, you can sort of hear he's on the radar. But also they're listening to, what Stevie Wonder and maybe Keith Emerson are doing with synthesizers.
Very much.
There's a kind of cutting edge element to
Soul, Motown, it's all in there.
It's all,
Singer-songwriter. Randy Newman is in there. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, there's an anti-snob enthusiasm and openness. And, I think this is it, that, something like an Elton or a Stevie Wonder of 72, they're listening out to fusion, pop, soul. They're being true to their roots as well.
I think that's the beauty. One of the beauties about Elton is that he is such a music fan. As he's very famously, he's still very passionate about music, a music fan first and foremost. But it doesn't matter because he always transcends it. He always sounds just like Elton John.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of, I think, them drawing influences from Americana at this time. It sounds very British. It sounds very English. But at the same time, of course, he was having massive success in America because there was enough of the DNA, American DNA in there to make it appeal to the American market too.
Well, he also pulls off that trick that obviously Procol Harum did as well, where the lead vocalist sounds completely convincing singing somebody else's words.
Right. Yes. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. This is amazing. 2 albums this year. And Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, a double album, is just a few months around the corner as well. This is what I talk about, this incredible work rate. And it's not just about the singles. They are great, great albums.
Well, I think that's what differentiates the 2 Stevie Wonder albums, Music of My Mind and Talking Book. They are both brilliant, equally good. In some ways, I might have slightly more time for Music of My Mind, but Talking Book is that Ziggy Stardust transformer. It's got 3 or 4 killer songs, which Music of My Mind possibly doesn't. It's a great album, but, Superstitious, obviously, amazing. You're the Sunshine of My Life. There are so many strong, memorable, iconic tracks in Talking Book, and it still takes risks, like the Elton album. This was where I think Music of My Mind was the first one where Stevie Wonder had complete control, because I think after the success of Marvin Gaye in 71 with What's Going On, Stevie Wonder wanted the same level of control. He was experimenting with synths. This is the thing. It's brilliant mainstream music that manages to be accessible while taking risks with texture, tone, synths that are pretty avant-garde.
It feels like the first Stevie Wonder album.
Yeah.
Doesn't it? And, he's still only, 19, 20 years old? He's still
quite old.
He's still very young. It's just right at most people would be just at the beginning of their career, but of course, he's probably made about 10 albums before this. But the albums before that would have been more a couple of hits and some filler. And as you say, this is now the Marvin Gaye influence beginning to impact the rest of the soul music and R&B music scene.
He's so sophisticated. This is the thing. One of the themes I think, again, is going to come up in 1972. That, as you've just said, he's 19, 20 or what have you. And this music is so sophisticated, emotionally, lyrically, musically, in a way that staggers me. There are so many astonishing, precocious
He's already an auteur. He's like an auteur, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's got a whole vision, to the point that he's also, a bit like Bowie, he's also producing these other artists as well around him and having massive hits, Cyrita and all these other people. But
there's the maturity of a 50-year-old in some of this
it's incredible. It's like it's like a prodigy. You know, I mean, everyone said he was a prodigy,
Yeah.
but very few prodigies actually transition to the world of albums and
Yeah.
making great adult records too. And he certainly pulled it off in spades.
I mean, Stevie Winwood was
Steve
probably
Winwood,
an equivalent as well around this time.
yeah, Harry Styles is doing it right now. Other mainstream artists that put out great records this year. Now, this is an artist I don't know much about, and I think you've mentioned him before on the show, Tim. Labby Sifri.
Yeah.
Crying, Laughing, Loving, Lying is his record from this year.
Yeah. Well, he was sort of making music that I'd sort of say fits into a post-Beatles Cat Stevens territory. He's writing, you'll know It Must Be Love.
That's
which
the only
is the
song.
big hit from
The only
this.
song I do know because of the Madness.
But
cover
equally,
mainly. Yeah.
he's producing some amazingly sensitive, articulate singer-songwriter work that sort of puts him in the Nick Drake, John Martin category on occasion, because again, he's effortlessly fusing post-Beatles elements with folk music, a little bit of jazz,
So a little bit
great
Terry Callier
arrangements,
kind
a little bit of Terry Callier as
Yeah.
well. I mean, Terry Callier
Yeah.
had an amazing album this year, which has
We're going to talk about that later. Yeah, but I mean, in terms of sort of, spanning that world of folk music.
It's
and
a
soul
lovely
music.
album, and
Yeah.
I wonder, Labby Sifri certainly should have been as big as Cat Stevens, and certainly should be spoken of in the same way that a lot of the early 70s British singer-songwriters are. And he sort of appeared, I think, on kind of BBC variety shows, because I think he also had, with things like It Must Be Love, there was a slightly, and I guess Cat Stevens had this as well, slightly jauntier, more commercial element to some of his singles. But, there's some great, as with Elton, deep cuts on this, the title track being one of them. So I just think he's a really underrated songwriter from this period, but I'd also say that about somebody like Gilbert O'Sullivan, who did produce beautiful mainstream hit singles. And clearly there was a talent and an intelligence and a depth in these people's work. And I guess that because, they ended up in the charity shops of the 80s, and because they've been seen on these tacky ITV, BBC variety shows, in the next generation, they were slightly dismissed. And I think it's totally unfair.
Scott Walker, another of our favourites on the show, drinking game, folks, get ready. Scott Walker's another one that kind of suffered from that sort of light entertainment tarnish through the 70s, didn't he? And we'll come on to talk about Scott later, because he also made an album this year, which is an interesting one. Okay, so I mean, Labby Sifri, I mean, in some ways a classic album years artist then, someone that made records that I'm not so familiar, an artist that made records you feel are just as good as what anybody was doing, but is pretty much
And he was
off the
having
radar.
success. He was certainly having successful singles.
Bee Gees made an album this year called To Whom It May Concern. Bee Gees were in the middle of a run where they were making these fantastically baroque pop records every year, but very much had fallen off the map at this point. This is between their sort of late 60s hits and the sort of disco era that was to come later. They're beautiful records. There's a kind of continuum of records during this period for the Bee Gees that I absolutely love. But I think we talked about one of them before in one of the previous shows.
Was Trafalgar before this?
We might have talked about Trafalgar or Life in a Tin Can. They're much of a muchness. I don't mean that in a derogatory way. They're all really, really strong records. Carpenter's A Song for You, kind of ditto. I mean, every Carpenter's album during this period had a couple of massive hit singles. I forget what the hit singles on this record were. They would have had a couple of massive hit singles, and the records are beautifully crafted, beautifully produced, middle of the road, orchestrated, pop, but with that voice.
Oh yeah. Well, I think this is that voice, and I kind of one album around this time, Baby I'm a Want You, Bread.
We're going to talk about that later.
Had certain aspects of that as well with the single. Anyway, again, it's that voice.
Yeah.
Glacial.
Paul Simon's debut, I believe it's his debut solo record.
I think it is, yeah.
Certainly eponymous. I'm not so familiar with it.
I'm not that familiar. I mean, again, I know the hit singles from it, and of course I've heard it and I own it, but it's not one of the ones I've played as much as his other catalogue. I mean, I think he's kind of finding his voice. I mean, Me and Julio, but Schoolyard, whatever, that's, I think, the big hit from this, and it's inventive, it's good.
I mean, he's brilliant,
It's
isn't he?
Paul Simon.
He's a brilliant
Everything he touches. He's an amazing vocalist, certainly one of the era's greatest lyricists. I mean, for me, I kind of prefer some of his later solo albums, and I prefer some of the earlier Simon & Garfunkel albums. He went Bookends, I think we discussed in 1968, which is one of my favourite Paul Simon-related records.
Anything with America on.
Yeah.
It's going to be a winner for me. Also this year, an album by someone that's a bit of an album year's favourite, but a bit of a one-sided album year's favourite, because I know very little about him. So every time we talk about Randy Newman, and we've talked about him a lot, I have to defer to you. Sail Away, is this one of the classic definitive Randy Newman
Well, this
records?
is one of the ones that kind of defined him as a critic's favourite, and it was, I guess, quite popular by Randy Newman standards, not as popular as 77's Little Criminals. And Little Criminals actually is one of my favourite albums by Randy, and he gets the Eagles on backing vocals on that album, and it was huge. It had a huge hit single,
Tim, we've
but
got
it
a very
also
long
had
list of albums from 1972 to talk
very
about. If you're going to
beautiful
start talking
deep
about albums from
cuts.
other years that we've already talked about, we're going to be here all year. Just saying.
You're getting shirty.
Just saying. If you're going to start talking
No,
about
it's great.
albums
I mean, it's a very strong album. And again, you know, Randy Newman is one of those guys who must have been maybe late 20s when he's making this album, but he could be 66. You know, he's got the composure of a Ray Charles. You know, he's got certain elements of kind of Ray Charles, Louis Armstrong in his delivery. And he did have some, you know, quite old influences, but this is quite a singer-songwriter album. The title track, which, you know, broaches in the topic of slavery, is seen as one of his greatest achievements. And what he tends to do, and I love doing this myself, and I think, you know, I love when other artists tend to do this, is he puts himself in the mind of the deplorable. So in some ways, he's playing awful characters on this album.
That's a Tom Waits thing too.
Tom Waits does this as well. And it's a really strong album. The title track is very, very powerful, but difficult to listen to, especially now, I think.
So one more entry we must talk about in the mainstream category. The Stones released Exile on Main Street this year. What a fantastic album. This is the definitive early 70s shambling Stones at their best. Exile on Main Street's got a more ramshackle quality to it, which I would have thought you would really like, personally.
It's odd. I've not heard it that often, so I can't really talk on this with any authority.
Let's have a listen to a listener's review of Exile on Main Street. Rob.
Hi, this is Diego from Bolivia, and I decided to choose Exile on Main Street by the Rolling Stones, as I think that it stands as a monumental achievement in rock history. For me, it encapsulates the raw and unpolished energy of rock and roll in that particular moment. It's fascinating that this album emerged during a turbulent period for the band, and despite, or perhaps because of this chaotic backdrop, the album's gritty and even eclectic mix of blues, rock, soul, gospel captured the essence of the band's rebellious style and spirit. I think it's a seminal work in rock music.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Diego. I think that's exactly what I should have said about it. So
I'll go with Diego. I'm with Diego.
I mean, it's a masterpiece. In some ways, you know, one of the interesting things about this is, if I wanted to mention this earlier when you were sort of referring to Bowie, we were talking about Bowie. We set out when we started this podcast to not talk about what we felt with the canon albums, the albums that had been talked about ad infinitum. And we've kind of fallen off that wagon a little bit because we have ended up, in a way, having to talk about these albums because there are certain albums like Ziggy that cast a shadow over a lot of other things that come out during the same period. And so it's difficult not to talk about some of these records. And I say that because we're going to move on to a category that you've called Progressosaurus Rex, UK division. In many ways, 1972 is also the high watermark for everything that we come to know of as progressive rock. Now, we might have also said that about 1973, but I think 1972, I think the evidence here will bear this out.
Yeah.